People of Earth, we have come to upgrade your cosmic consciousness. DNA activation ready. In 3, 2, 1.
Hi, welcome to Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership. I'm Lou Quinto.
And I'm Craig Anderson.
Craig, we have another return guest. We had Donna Marcus last week, and this week we have Kevin King of Transformation Point. And Kevin, if you remember from, it's been almost a year where we talked to Kevin. He's an organizational consultant. He's an executive coach. He's also an author and he's a speaker. And he is our expert when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I thought in our discussions that you and I were having that it was time to go back and revisit the DEI subject matter. That's short for diversity, equity, and inclusion, in case you missed it. But companies like acronyms, so DEI. And let's go back and revisit the DEI situation because things have changed significantly since we last spoke with Kevin. We spoke with him right after the George Floyd situation. There was a lot of, holding hands, kumbaya. Everyone was, yes, we need to make changes. But really over the last 5 to 6 months, a lot of things have changed. And it's time to revisit that subject. So without any further ado, which I hate that phrase, but it sounded appropriate at this time, let's bring on Kevin King. Kevin King, welcome back to Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership. You are, in the last 2 weeks, our second repeat guest on Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership. And so 2 weeks ago, we had the COO of a law firm and talking about culture and the hybrid culture with the remote and working in the office. And we wanted to find out what her progress has been and where their firm is right now. And we heard some really great things. And we wanted to bring you back to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion again. That's what you came and talked to us about a year ago. And when we talked during that interview, things were, there was a lot of unity when it comes to race relations. It was the George Floyd situation, and you had the communities coming together because of a very tragic wrong that happened. But in the last 6 months, things have changed. And diversity and equity and inclusion is still important in the corporate environment, but there's a lot of obstacles that are being, how can I say, thrown up against that movement to be able to get more diversity and inclusion within an organization. We're seeing it in our school systems where, we can't teach, we're being told that teachers can't teach things that may offend students. And you're talking about a 4-year-old, or I shouldn't say a 4-year-old, but a 7 or an 8-year-old. Anything offends a 7-year or an 8-year-old. What they brought to lunch offends them because they wanted peanut butter and jelly and you sent them with a ham sandwich. And I think we're opening ourselves up to really isolating ourselves in different corners. And so Craig and I wanted to bring you back to get your opinion on some issues that are out there that may prevent the progress of good D&I programming. So let me start by asking you, have things changed now that I get done with my rant?
I think that on the surface we can form that perspective. But it's just as before. Many of the incidents that have happened over the last 5 or so years were happening all along, and people it wasn't in the public conversation. I think it can appear just because we're not focused on those things or talking about them, or they're not as mediated as they maybe have once been. That somehow something's really changed. And I think the everyday experience of women and people of color in the United States hasn't necessarily changed just because we're not talking about it. I think we're talking about larger systemic changes that have to take place in order for there to be real change that happens. So I think on the surface, it may appear that things have changed, but the conversation is ongoing.
Okay. Have they changed for the better or for the worse?
I think we have more public discourse about the topic today.
Okay.
I think we hear about it more in the media
Hmm.
today. And so, in that regard, I think the conversation is still happening, which is, in my opinion, overtly happening instead of covertly or being diminished in the public sphere. So, therefore, yes, I think that is a good thing.
Okay. All right. Diversity training was something that became real popular
Mhm.
in probably the late 90s. Is that correct? You're the expert on this.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Over just the last 10 years, how has that diversity training that people may be accustomed to, if they're some of our viewers and listeners, of, yeah, I went
Mhm.
through diversity training, we sat in a circle, everyone said what upset me about you, and
Mhm.
I told you what upset me about, everybody, and I felt uncomfortable, and it was almost like a group therapy session that we went through.
Mhm.
Has that changed to be more impactful? Because I don't really think that was an impactful training, in my
Um,
opinion.
Yeah, I would not take today's diversity, equity, and inclusion training to be aligned with those efforts. I would, if I were going to use phraseology to distinguish between the two, I would say those early trainings were more around sensitivity training,
Right.
whereas today's training is really more about how to navigate difference, how to identify the biases that lead us to behave towards each other in the ways that we do in society and in the workplace. And so I would say in today's environment, diversity training is very different than that training.
Okay. How? If I went through it in the early 2000s
Mhm.
and all of a sudden I'm hearing diversity training again, what's my expectation from the benchmark of that sensitivity
Mhm.
training type session to what's going on today? Give me some specific examples of what I should expect in that new training.
I think if I were going to really hone it down and simplify it, I would say that the major difference is that today's training is not about guilt. It really is about learning how to be a more inclusive leader. I think it also emphasizes that all human beings, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of sexual orientation, have bias. And bias isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's just a preference for one thing over another thing. And
Mhm.
so I believe that in today's environment, that training is really drilling down into what the nature of bias is, the fact that it's a part of our lived experience, it's part of the human condition, it's a part of our DNA and our survival instinct to distinguish between things that are threats to us versus things that are safe.
Right.
And that it takes, I think today's training emphasizes the fact that there's a skill set and a process that we can go through to be more effective at recognizing and identifying what those biases are,
Right.
managing ourselves through them, and creating a more inclusive and equitable place for all of us to be able to contribute to the levels of our potential.
Right. Yeah, because one of the things that I read in my homework prior to you coming back and joining us on the podcast was unconscious bias,
Mhm.
and how not just individuals but companies need to recognize their unconscious biases. What are some things our our listeners and viewers can do to, I won't say eliminate unconscious bias, because
Mhm.
that can't happen, but to be aware of unconscious bias?
Well, one of the things that we do in our training is we start with a network analysis. Who are the people in our networks? Who are the people that are not in our networks? And why might that exist? And those three networks typically that I talk about personally in my trainings are the professional network, the personal network, and then our community or our neighborhood. And by doing that network analysis, we identify the amount of exposure that we actually have.
Mhm.
And in the absence of exposure, then we are relying on mediated accounts, lived, other experiences, things that we've been indoctrinated into by key influences in our lives that kind of drive what that bias is.
Right.
So one of the examples I use that might be relevant here is this: there are two people equally situated. Person A is a person that has, for whatever reason, stepped outside of their comfort zone quite a bit in their life to have experiences, diverse experiences with a broad set of people. And so person A is very comfortable being uncomfortable, to the point where it doesn't necessarily feel like discomfort anymore.
Right.
Person B is a person that either by choice or just lack of opportunity has not stepped out of their comfort zone very often. These two people have two different sets of experiences. And when they're dealing with difference, they have different tools and different repertoires that they have available to them to navigate those differences. For example, I've worked with people from over 10 different countries. I've worked in more than 10 different countries, and I've worked with people from over 40. I am very comfortable stepping into situations with a variety of different types of people. Whereas the opposite of me would be someone that hasn't had that experience. And it's likely then that they would bring more bias, more discomfort to those situations, because they just haven't had the opportunity to build the competence and the confidence to be successful, or to at least be able to lean into them from the perspective of being able to be successful navigating those differences. The other part of your question is about a systemic perspective. And so when you look at organizations dealing with bias, often that bias is embedded in our systems, our policies, and the way that we approach certain things. And quite often, those unconscious biases exist in those systems in terms of how we evaluate potential candidates, right? And if we use not processes that are not best practice, we can have human bias enter in the selection process, versus from a systemic perspective, if we use best practice of blind interviews, being able to have blind resume reviews and things of that nature, that we have consistency and panel interviews and the like, we minimize the amount of bias that actually occurs in the hiring process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I was talking to an individual, and we were talking about the blind resume. But when they come in initially, Kevin King would make it through that blind, area where the person I was talking to, his first name's Darius. And he said, I get flagged. He said, Darius is not an Anglo-Saxon white WASP name. And it's like there's that unconscious bias that we're talking about here, that there's a pause on that one. And all of a sudden in my mind, then I may have a bias toward this just because of the name. And so I'm glad you brought that up. Greg, you're going to?
Well, it's going back a step, Kevin, but we've talked a lot about this idea of leaders having more empathy for their employees, and leading empathic leadership and leading from those considerations. And when I hear you talking about the DEI initiatives, I hear a lot of that, right? It's empathy. It's taking the other person's experience into consideration, but we don't seem to tie those things together. Are we not tying this idea of empathetic and supportive and servant leadership into these same DEI ideas? Because I don't seem to see them contextually tied.
I believe empathy is foundational, right? As well as curiosity, for that matter. But again, there's a certain duality that takes place, where if I'm the person, let's say, for example, being perceived by someone else, and I am being viewed through the lens of their bias, I have to also recognize that I am also viewing them through the lens of my own bias. And it was really only through that empathetic, curious perspective that allows us to get to what's behind the curtain. So I think I may have said this in our last interview, which is we have more in common with each other than we know, but we never get to the story. Why? Because we don't get past the initial stages of that bias that keeps us sort of polarized. So if in fact I am truly curious about you, and understanding why you see the world the way that you do, and the experiences that you've had that have contributed to that, and you tell me your story, it's not that I'm feeling sorry for you. I just recognize that your story is likely not going to be very different than my own in certain circumstances. Now, if I'm talking to, say, for example, a white person, and I'm talking to that person through the lens of my Blackness, for example, yeah, that person probably can't feel what I feel, and they can't possibly even imagine what it's like to be me. It would be really difficult for that person to put themselves into my shoes, but they can humanize me and have empathy for the fact that no one should likely live through whatever the experience might be. If in fact it's a traumatic experience or something along those lines, that they can humanize me in a way to understand that they wouldn't want their child to experience something like that. They themselves would not want to have to experience something like that. And so I think, to Craig's point, the foundation of this is really that empathy, but it's how do I get your story? Without the story, it makes it very difficult for us to be able to have that empathy. And so part of that is and the challenge is creating a space where we can come together and tell our stories and feel vulnerable enough to really share those stories so that we can humanize each other. And I think that often, to Craig's point, gets left out of the equation, is that we lean in with humanization first, that allows us to be able to connect around some common concept or common experience, that then allows us to really feel for each other and open up the dialogue that allows us to reach a broader based understanding of each other's experience.
Yeah. I should have set this up at the very beginning, but I can imagine if I'm a listener or viewer asking the question is I read a lot about diversity and equity and inclusion, and I'm seeing it on the news recently with the Miami Dolphins head coach and that whole NFL, that Rooney Rule. First of all, I would ask a question just as someone who's a management consultant: why do you have to have that rule? And we know why they have to have the rule. But if you have to have the rule, that should be a large, we have a problem sign. If you have to have a rule that says you have to interview at least one person of color for a coaching position, a head coaching position, and so we can go down that whole path. But explain to our viewers and listeners, what is the problem that an organization has that the diversity, equity, and inclusion will solve? Give me the reason on why. Tell our listeners, why is this important? What's it going to solve? Well,
if not from a social perspective, well, we just break it down in dollars and cents. Okay. The research tells us that the companies, and Deloitte has done this research, that the companies that are more diverse outperform financially. And from profitability terms, they're closest less diverse competitor.
Right.
And so there's a dollars and cents component to it as well, but you can't achieve those dollars and cents unless you're actually walking the talk.
Yeah.
So having diversity is just the representation of difference in your organization. Inclusion is what you do with it. And it's about how you develop that talent, how you orchestrate it in a way that people can contribute to the level of their potential. So representation without inclusion doesn't really get an organization that much further down the road.
Right.
The equity component is that we're recognizing that people are starting at different points on the starting line for a myriad of different reasons, whether it be old policies, laws, practices within organizations where people inherently experience certain forms of discrimination that put them behind. Right. And so equity is not about lowering the standard. It really is about recognizing that people don't start on the same place in the starting line, and that certain people need additional supports and in order to be able to contribute to the level of their potential. And so with that, organizations that are embracing all three of those elements recognize that, and they recognize and create the developmental opportunities for people to be able to contribute, again, to the maximum of their potential. But it's also about orchestrating that in a way that allows there to be tremendous benefit and higher levels of engagement within the workplace. I think we talked about this last time as well, which is what people are really looking for is an environment where they feel like they belong. And the second component is they want to feel as if they're valued for their uniqueness. And so that value of my uniqueness allows me to contribute and feel like what I have to bring to the table is truly going to be valued, and it's going to be included in the way that we approach and solve organizational problems. And so with that said, what I would say is this: the thing that equity, diversity, and inclusion solves for from an organizational context is that it allows us to humanize our entire organization and foster an environment where people can excel and they can contribute to the level of their potential. And the direct benefit to the organization of doing so is profitability, less turnover, higher levels of engagement, a more competitive organization.
Right, right. In fact, I just got done what you're talking about. I got done listening to the Blinkist version. Okay, and this isn't an ad for Blinkist, but I did of Heather McGee's book, Zero Sum Game. I don't know if you're familiar with that book and her writing, and she's got a new one out that I can't wait to read. But you know, it's that mentality that if a different population demographic of people, you know, get something, that means it gets taken away from me. And in her book, she does a great job of describing throughout history. And I'm going back to that unconscious bias on why that unconscious bias, you know, that definitely exists. So in an organization, let me ask this question. Where is the most resistance that you find as a consultant, someone who's going in and you're working with leaders? Where are you finding the most resistance to the diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, if I can call it that?
Yeah, I would say that if in fact it's programming in an organization, they've got it wrong.
Okay, good.
This is a strategic initiative. And it's not about what we're doing, it's about how equity, diversity, and inclusion fits into how we achieve our results. And equity, diversity, and inclusion is just a competitive advantage. The more diverse your organization is, in my opinion, the more competitive it is. And Deloitte has done its research, and other organizations have done that as well. So it goes beyond just my opinion.
Yeah,
I would say the resistance in an organization to equity, diversity, and inclusion generally is going to fall on the side of the organization where you have people that have not had the opportunity or have not taken advantage of opportunities to step outside of their comfort zone. And so just as any of us, when we're uncomfortable, it polarizes us. It creates a great deal of inertia wherever that mindset sits within an organization. So I would say that it's more of a people-centric scenario than it is a policy-centric scenario. Policy reinforces what people are capable of doing. And so if we want to diminish the power of people to be roadblocks to equity, diversity, and inclusion, we diminish that power through the changes in policy. And once those changes in policy happen, which is, in my opinion, if I were to answer your question more directly, it's not with an individual in the organization. It is about the policy architecture and structure in an organization that drives the greatest degree of resistance. Why? Because it gives people the ability to engage in behavior and policies that are inequitable, and and ultimately it gives them the power to behave in certain patterns of behavior that don't align with equity, diversity, and inclusion. When you change the policy, you change the power structure within an organization, and you create a much more level playing field, because people now don't have policy to reference as the reason why they're doing the things that they're doing.
Right. And you've mentioned that report twice, and while you were talking, I found it. And the report says that companies in the top quarter for racial, ethnic, and gender diversity were 35 to 15% more likely to have financial returns above their national industry medians. So from a financial perspective, right there, I mean, 15 to 35% above your average national median for the industry. We need this, guys.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Gals, I should say, since we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let me not forget that. But okay, I was hoping that you were going to say that you were going to give me hope for the future, that there's generational issues in the acceptance.
Generational issues.
Okay, all right. So can you give me some hope for the future, that the next generation of leaders, this is not going to be something that they believe they shouldn't focus on? It's going to be it's going to be part of their natural leadership. Is they don't need to be taught it?
I don't know that. I mean, we're talking about human beings, so And with human beings,
Yeah.
inherently, as I said before, there's bias
Right.
of however a person is socialized, whatever they consume. And we can talk all about technology and the ability to consume only what it is that we want to consume that reinforces certain points of view.
Yep.
But what I will say is this: we're in a multi-generational workforce right now. And what I'm seeing with the client work that I'm doing, that amplifies the need for equity, diversity, and inclusion in an organization. It also shines a bright light on some of how complex and how challenging moving an organization forward down the equity, diversity, and inclusion road is. Because think about it, we've got boomers in the workplace, we've got Xers in the workplace, we've got Zennials, which is that midpoint on the millennials curve. We have Generation Z, we have Xers out there.
Yep.
And so if you think about it, depending on
and there's still some veterans too. So
Yes.
we could be talking about 5 generations that are in the workforce, which is the most multi-generational workforce that we've seen ever.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so when you think about multi-generational, it's not about capability, it's about mindset.
Okay.
It's about what people have been socialized into.
Mhm.
And so when you get these 5, think about it, if you only got 2 different perspectives in the room, and now we're talking about 4 to 5 different perspectives in the room around the same topic with people that have been socialized with very different expectations and very different experiences, that adds a degree of complexity, I think, that many organizations need to make sure that they're paying attention to. It's not just about whether or not you strategically embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's about adoption within your organization and recognizing the nuances across these different generational differences. So you take generational differences and don't even think about equity, diversity, and inclusion and how difficult that has been for organizations to navigate. And now you add the complexity of equity, diversity, and inclusion and different mindsets around it. It's real. It's a real challenge for every organization out there that is strategically undertaking this roadmap.
Right.
So just to, a lot of what we're talking about feels to me like we're talking about big companies, right? Big companies can afford to bring you in, they can afford to bring Lou in, they can afford to bring speakers in and programs.
Mm-hmm.
But I think back to my last business, 50 to 60 people, call center business, women and men, all white, leading the company on the leadership team, incredibly socioeconomically diverse call center, right? Lower socioeconomic, racial, women. How do I, as the leader of that business who can't afford to go out and bring a program in, but how do I go in? Because where I would love to see myself in that business, and we did this a bit, is how do I go into the call center and say, how can I help cultivate you and grow you into that leadership business? How do I start wrapping that in rather than go out and trying to hire diversity in my organization at the leadership level? How do I create it effectively if I'm a small business owner differently than I might do if I'm, mega corporation?
So if I understand the question correctly, are we talking about more diversity and so more diversity in the workforce in a smaller organization?
I guess what I would say is at the call center level of my organization, it was incredibly diverse. At the leadership level, it wasn't.
Okay.
What I would love to do is, how do I go into that call center and say, I want to help this representation move into my leadership level. I want to develop you as a leader, knowing that we have very little in common. I don't understand their life to our conversation around empathy and our conversation around experience. How do I do that? How do I start building that in an effective way and organically grow that, right? So I'm building it inside rather than trying to bring it from outside, if that makes sense.
Got it. Okay. So if in fact if I go to one of your points, Craig, I don't understand the people in my call center. I don't have that connection with them. The first thing I would caution and say is that it's not their job to educate you. It's your job to educate yourself. And through that education is the opportunity to engage in best practice, which is if you look at your existing leadership team and you want to have more equity, more diversity on that team, but in an inclusive and equitable way, right? So in other words, not only do you want the representation, you also want it to be inclusive. Then there are a couple of different things that are available to you. you can go and make yourself aware, and you can build developmental pathways within your existing workforce. So look through, do the talent review, figure out who your high potentials are, figure out what level of investment you're willing to make, whether it be from an educational perspective or otherwise, to elevate those people, to create opportunities for them, I should say, to elevate themselves to higher levels of leadership and management within your organization. And so that scaffolding of understanding who the people are, what are the developmental needs, putting in place the scaffolding to close that developmental gap, to raise the level of readiness of people within your organization, and promote from within. That would be the work looking at it from a bottom-up perspective. The other opportunity is to look at it from a top-down perspective, which is, how do I get more representation on my team so that I don't have to do the heavy lifting all by myself? I bring the perspective, the more inclusive perspective, into my organization from a leadership perspective, so it's incorporated in our strategy, and that we then initiate and spawn off initiatives designed to create more diversity and that developmental pathway within the organization, so that you have internal candidates that are now highly viable candidates for higher level positions within your organization. Notice that in either case, it's not going to be solved overnight.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And
that was, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and the other component of it is that it's not a program, it's a part of who we are. And so what better way to model that than for you yourself to embody that mindset, but also expect that to be embodied in the mindset of the other executives that are part of your, or the other leadership personnel that are part of your organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's all anecdotal, right? But it was amazing to me when we would try and tap people on the shoulder in there and say, hey, we see, why aren't you applying for this job? What can we do? And so many people that we saw the potential and didn't see it in themselves, which is some part of everything that we're talking about, to say, no, we see it in you and we want to get you there. And, so they weren't even thinking we would consider them for the job. And it was just sad in many ways that they didn't even see it in themselves. And so that feels like, how do we help people see that potential? And it's a lot of what you were just talking about, right? Tapping them on the shoulder, having those developmental conversations, getting it into the leadership team or the rank and file to say, we need to have these conversations with everybody. And it was such an interesting, we just had such a weird dichotomy of it, right? In our group, and trying to figure out how to bridge that gap without coming across in a way that is demeaning or insulting, or, asking them to solve my problem for me. It was just, again, just a difference of experience and trying to have some of those more natural conversations. So there's just such an opportunity, I think, in the small business community for so many of these things, not just the big corporate community.
And again, speaking anecdotally, I would say a couple of different things about what you've shared about the detail and offering people opportunities. I think one of the things that's important to consider is that people, all of us, carry a certain amount of trauma with us. And so when we see someone that we believe in them more than they believe in themselves, I feel like that's the opportunity to actually lean in more with people. Because if in fact they don't see their potential within themselves, the question that I think we're challenged by is, what can I do? What are the supports? This is coming back to the equity part of it. What are the supports that I need to put in place so that those people actually do see the potential that they have, that they do deal with the trauma that may be causing them to second guess themselves or not see themselves as a part of or a candidate for those types of roles within the organization. And I think it's easy, and I'm not saying this applies to your situation, it's easy to say, well, I gave you an opportunity, but you didn't step up to the plate. I can't make you believe in yourself. And actually, this is where empathy comes into play, which is you felt like it was sad. And that is the empathy right? It's not feeling sorry for it, but it was sad. And in that sadness is the opportunity for greatness, which is, I don't want you to feel, I want to understand more about why you don't see yourself as a candidate, and I do. And I want to do and understand what I need to do more of and what I need to do less of, or the opportunities I need to provide more of, and the opportunity more of for you to truly see yourself as a leader and manager in this organization.
Yep.
And
Right.
that is going above and beyond.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
It's not what we typically expect from organizations, but it is kind of what we expect from great ones.
Right. Well, Kevin, do me a favor, and before we get into key takeaways, give me some hope, because I've got a grandson who's biracial, and he'll be 4 years in July, but I've learned things from his father. Unfortunately, his father passed away in October of COVID. So, but during the 3.5 years that I was able to get to know him, he shared things with me. And again, it's telling the story, understanding where that whole thing. And he and I had some very in-depth and very emotional conversations about each other, understanding each of us. And because I'll never forget one conversation, he said, because it was really hitting me hard. And he said, but you need to know this because your grandson will have the same story and he'll have these same experiences. And you need to be able to either prevent those experiences before they happen, or you need to be able to be there to answer questions about those experiences. So give me some hope when it comes to the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate America, or I won't say corporate America because you deal with international too. Internationally, give me some hope.
I believe in humanity. I just believe in humanity, and organizations are made up of people,
right?
And I believe in the best in what we're capable of bringing to the table. There are realities and disparities that various different groups that have marginalized identities experience in society. It's real. We experience it professionally, we experience it personally, and we experience it in our communities. And so with that, I'd say that my positive perspective, because I too will be the parent of a biracial child come this June when our daughter is born. And my wife and I talk about that quite often. And we recognize that her identity is likely to be in today's society a Black female.
Right.
And what our hope is that through nurturing each other, loving each other, giving each other a solid sense of self, and such that people can truly come into organizations with less trauma and more confidence in who it is that they are, that we will see more and more leaders of color, leader of different genders, different sexual orientations, and so forth, that become the role models and the examples, not only for people that identify as they do, but for all of us. Right. And I think we see that. I think we've seen examples of that in our society so far. I think that there's this tremendous opportunity to see more of it in the future. I think that what has happened since the last time I was here as a guest is that we see more in from an advertising perspective. We see more diversity in advertisement today.
Oh, yeah.
We see organizations taking a stand for what they truly believe in. Not necessarily just for financial gain.
Right.
And I think that there's a social transformation that is a positive one that's taking place. And just as in any other transformation, it's hard at first and then it gets better. And I believe I think my positive hope for the future is that although it's as painful as it may be today, that we're on the trajectory of making a substantial difference in society, not only here in the United States, but around the world.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. Well, I know you've got a hard stop. So Craig, give me your key takeaway for our discussion with Kevin when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, I think what I'm going to take away today is just that starting point of that genuine curiosity. And that's a great place. If we can really start there, then so much can flow out from understanding. So I'll go with curiosity.
Yep. No. And as you were talking, mine associates a little bit with that in the sense that when I do critical thinking, I talk about keeping an open mind. And one of the things that I suggest as one of my top 10 ways to keep an open mind is that next time you get some friends together, invite somebody different. In fact, someone who doesn't look like you and your friends, and watch the conversation change immediately. And I would recommend everybody do that. So that's my key takeaway. Kevin, your key takeaway.
My key takeaway is I was on a call with one of my other clients the other day, and it was an international group, and just the representation of how much diversity was there when we were talking about the topic of diversity gave me hope that from an international perspective, when professionals lean in with each other and work together, that there's a sense of respect and appreciation and valuing that is real, that is not made up. And my takeaway is that there is value in having diverse representation and diverse experiences, because once we have a taste of it, we want more of it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Kevin King of Transformation Point, how can people, if they want to bring you into their organization, or if they want to know some more information about diversity, equity, inclusion, how can they get in touch with you?
They can either reach me through our website, transformationpoint.com, and they can also reach me at kevin@transformationpoint.com.
Fantastic. Well, Kevin, thanks for joining us again on Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership. And I want to say, hopefully we won't have to have you on again, but you know, this is a new area. I look forward to having you on again. So thanks for taking time to join us and to educate not only Craig and I, but our viewers and listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Lou, that was another great interview with Kevin. So insightful, lots of good questions and lots of good information that I hope our listeners and viewers benefit from as they go back and look at that. And I'd encourage them also to go watch the first interview back in the archive as well.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said in introducing Kevin, a lot of things have changed, and companies are seeing financial success when they have a significant diversity, equity, and inclusion, in their workplace, in their culture, anywhere from 15 to 35% against the industry median average. So when it comes to profits, so I would definitely recommend that if it's not happening within your organization and you have the ability to make changes, that you do. If you don't have the ability to make changes, start talking to other people and try to create that awareness and that change that needs to take place. So that's my final comments.
All right, very good. Well, we hope you join us every week here on Q&A on Breakthrough Leadership. New episodes premiere every Thursday. You can find us on all your favorite social media platforms, on our website, qaleadership.com, as well as all your favorite podcasting platforms like Spotify and iTunes. So until next time, I'm Craig Anderson.
And just be the best leader you can be. I'm Lou Quinto.